Hi, this is Ray Farrow, and I'm so glad again to be with you, to be taping our online Sunday school lessons. Thanks to Mary Dan, as always, for filming and for editing, and so much goes into not just doing this, but to every aspect of our church life and ministry here on campus and up at the pavilion. And so I hope you're praying for your staff, for all the workers, for all the ministers, be they paid or not, for the ministries that they have, because this takes time and it takes effort. And I know for Mary, it's a labor of love for her to do it. She considers it her ministry, but it's important to me. When you think about teams, say, winning a college football championship or a Super Bowl, there are always, those folks that you don't even think about who are in the background, be they assistant coaches or groundskeepers or just all the folks who go into making something a success. And that's not to belittle anybody. It's just to say that it takes everybody. And so I hope that you're praying during this time and always for the folks at Kyoki who help make all this happen and who do it because they love the Lord and they love you. And I hope you're praying for your Sunday school teachers this week as we're getting back into the swing here in the building. Always remember that you are somebody's teacher out there. You are a missionary to somebody, that somebody is seeing God through you. And we all have a part to play in ministry. So as we go to Isaiah 7 to 17, we primarily know this section because of Isaiah 14 and the promise of the Son, the sign to come, Emmanuel, God with us. But there's an interesting background to this messianic prophecy that we want to study today as we look at how God made a promise to a wicked and unfaithful king. God made it trying to help this king and trying to help his kingdom and his people, and yet this king did not respond to God's gift, God's offering, to his present, to his promise. And so we're going to see an important lesson for us as we look at our world and our homes today. Isaiah 7 to 17 begins with a problem, and we get the sense of it, or God's answer to it. The "Thus says the Lord" begins verse 7. It shall not stand, it shall not come to pass. And so our first question is, okay, what shall not stand? What shall not come to pass? Well, the problem was that two kings north of Judah, we remember if Judah is the southern kingdom, say here, and I'm not drawing borders and boundaries to scale, but above Judah you had the northern kingdom. If this is the southern kingdom of Judah, you had the northern kingdom of Israel. And then above Israel, you had Damascus, you had Syria and Aram up above here. The Aram and Syria with Damascus as its capital were here. And then over in this area, right, over in this area, and it's not exact, but you had the nation of Assyria, and Assyria was a little bit north too. I can bring this up a little bigger, but Assyria was threatening this area. Assyria was wanting to come down and begin conquest of these nations because these nations lied along the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, and so this was an important trade route leading down into Egypt. And so the problem was that Aram and Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, who were God's people like Judah was, and this nation here, Syria and Aram, they wanted to join in an alliance against Assyria, and they said, Judah, we need you to help us because Assyria could come and not only take over us, but continue and come down and swallow you up. So we'd like to establish a treaty and have you help us use your armies as well, so we can form an alliance and hold off Assyria. And the king of Judah, King Ahaz, was faced with this decision. Do I join with my fellow Jews here in Israel and join with this nation above them and fight against Assyria? Or do I ask the king of Assyria, please, whatever you do against them, we're not allied with them, please, just protect us. Don't battle against us, and we'll pay you tribute. We'll kind of be your servants. Or does King Ahaz, king of Judah, does he depend on God and say, God, you are our protector. We want you to save us and protect us. So that was the historical context. And Isaiah goes to King Ahaz because King Ahaz, excuse me, who, by the way, was an idol worshiper, a Baal worshiper, and had sacrificed his sons in worship, who was not a good king like his father or like his grandfather Uzziah. Now, Uzziah had problems with faithlessness late in life, but for the most part, Uzziah was a very good king. King Ahaz's father, Jotham, was a very good king, but Ahaz was not. He was wicked, and he had not gone to the Lord to seek the Lord's counsel, help, and protection. So that's the problem, is Ahaz won't go to God, is being threatened by these two other kingdoms that if you don't join with us against Assyria, we're going to come and attack you and subjugate your armies and your monies and make you kind of join us. And he doesn't want to do that. And so instead, what he does is go to the king of Assyria, King Tiglath-Pileser, and say, please don't attack us. We're not part of these other two kingdoms. We're not fighting with them. Please protect us. And as a result, we'll give you money, kind of tribute money, if you will, protection money, like paying a mobster. So that's the historical situation. And into that situation, because Ahaz has not gone to God to ask God's counsel, God sends Isaiah and says, Isaiah, if he won't come to me, I'm sending you to him to say, thus says the Lord God. This threatening by these two kings, the kings were Rezin, who was the king of Syria, and Pekah, who was the son of Remaliah, who was king of Israel, the northern kingdom. These two kings, in Isaiah verse 1 of chapter 7, it says, they came up to wage war to try and get the southern kingdom to join them by force now, because Ahaz has refused. But Ahaz's grandfather Uzziah had really fortified the city well, and they couldn't take over the city. And so, as it says in verse 2, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. They see these armies on the outskirts wanting to attack them, and their hearts are shaking. Now Isaiah says, don't be afraid of these two firebrands, these two smoldering stumps. Their threatening will not stand. Their taking you over will not come to pass. He says in verse 8, within 65 years, Ephraim, that is the northern kingdom, they're going to be shattered from being a people. And even before that, the nation of Aram, right, and Syria, that nation, that group, they're going to be gone even before the northern kingdom. So Isaiah is saying, God says, Don't be afraid, do not fear. Where have we seen this before? Right? The Exodus. As God's people stand coming out of Egypt at the Red Sea, and the Egyptian army is approaching, ready to swallow them up and take them into captivity, Moses, with a word from God, holds up his staff and says to the people, basically, be still. God says, be still and know that I am God. Don't worry about this approaching army. You're my people. I'm going to protect you. And then Isaiah says, King Ahaz, God's making you a present and a promise. He's making a gift to you. You ask for any sign. Verses 10 to 13. Ask a sign to the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol, basically the abyss, the grave, as deep as you could go. Let it be as high as the heavens, as the writer of your study says. Basically, the sky's the limit. But Ahaz says, when God says, you ask for any sign you want, and I'll give it to you. We remember that there are folks in the Old Testament who asked for signs. Gideon asked for 2 signs. The fleece be made wet and the ground dry. The fleece be made dry and the ground wet. This isn't Ahaz being impetuous. God isn't saying, you better trust me and don't even ask for a sign. God says, Ahaz, if you don't think you can trust me, ask anything you want as a sign, and I'll do it. God makes this gift, this present to it. Ahaz says, with false piety, false humility, trying to look religious. Folks, are there ever times where you've decided on your course of action what you want to do, and it's not what God says or wants, but you try to couch it in religious language? You know it's something that the Scripture has told you to do. You may read it in your daily Bible study. That situation may have come up, and you say, well, I'm going to pray on it. I'm going to pray on this to see if this is the word of the Lord for me. When you already know it is, but you want to couch it in religious language so that you look better to others. That's what Ahaz was doing. He says, I will not ask and put the Lord to the test. But God has said, Ahaz, it's all right to ask. Ask anything you want. Rather like when generations before, God had said to one of Ahaz's forefathers, Solomon, he said, Solomon, ask whatever you will, and I will give it to you. And Solomon asked for wisdom. Ahaz is given a chance to ask for any kind of sign. He says, I won't do it. And then, and the reason he's not going to do it, well, think about this. If before his whole court and everybody looking here at the springs, all the courtiers and officials and priests, if he says, all right, I'll ask for this sign, and everybody knows it, and Ahaz knows it, and Isaiah knows it, and the sign comes to pass, well then Ahaz has to put control into God's hands and say, God has been faithful, I will trust him, and I will not make an alliance with these 2 kingdoms to my north, and I will not make an alliance with Assyria that they won't attack me. I won't give them tribute money. All my praise and tribute will be to the Lord because he's going to protect me. Of course, Ahaz doesn't want to do that. In his humanity, in his human pride, what does he want to do? What do we want to do? We want to maintain control. We want to do it our way, and Ahaz wanted to do it his way. He'd already decided and told the king of Assyria, don't attack me. I'm trusting in you, Assyrian king. And when he says this, faking piety, religiosity, but really it's just because he wants prideful human control, it's as if Isaiah turns and he says, all right, king, if you won't be faithful, he then turns and says, hear then, O house of David. Because all those in this kingly realm, all those around the king, had to acknowledge, why is Ahaz king at all? Because he's part of the house of David. What has God done? He's told David, I'm going to make your kingdom an everlasting kingdom. I'm going to make a kingdom covenant with David, and I'm going to show my graciousness and my protection because of the promises I've made to David. So he says, all right, let me call on history then to witness against you. O house of David, who is only strong, not because you have protection from any other nation, but because you have deliverance and protection from me. O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men? He's saying, really? You won't give me an answer and say, here's the sign? Then it's not enough that you won't talk to me when you won't give me a sign. You're wearying God. You're wearing God out with your unfaithfulness and your lack of true devotion under this guise of false piety. God says, I'm going to give you the sign anyway. You refuse to ask for one? Fine. I'll make one unmistakable to everybody here in your presence, O king, so that they all know what's going to happen and that God has control over the future. He turns to the whole house of David, all the courtiers and officials and onlookers, and he says, verse 14, therefore, what do you mean, therefore? Because God wanted to protect you and promises to protect you if you will come to him, yet you refuse and you want to trust in other means. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. This wasn't one you picked, Ahaz. This wasn't one I picked as the courtly prophet, Isaiah. God himself is giving you this sign. Here it is. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. So the present is God will give you any sign. Ahaz doesn't want it. God said, I'm going to give you a sign anyway. And here it is. Emmanuel, virgin born, God with us. Born of a virgin. And this will be the sign. And so this prophecy comes as a way of showing Ahaz, God is with you right in this moment, but God is going to be with his people for the sake of his promises and his name and his reputation and his love that he has given to David. God's going to be with his people forever through this kingdom now in protecting Ahaz's kingdom for a time and taking away the threat of the two kingdoms to the north who are right there at his outskirts. Now, God says, I'm going to provide a double prophecy, a double fulfillment and blessing. So God says, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Now, if we go back and look at the beginning of this chapter, right? If we go back and look at the beginning of this chapter, Isaiah has told, the Lord has told Isaiah, go out and tell the king. He said, don't worry, I'm going to protect you. And in verse 8, he says, Syria, the head of Syria is Damascus, the head of Damascus is Rezin. So he says there's King Rezin, head of Syria and area north of there of Aram. And then there's King Pekah, who's head of the northern kingdom. He says, don't worry about those two. Within 65 years, Ephraim the northern kingdom will be shattered as a people. And if we look, do the math historically, by that time they had been carried away and they were shattered as a people. But Ahaz is standing there hearing, wait a minute, I'm in trouble right now at this moment. I've got basically, two wild dogs at my door ready to attack. I need help right now. I don't need a prophecy 65 years later. Or we might say, if this is a prophecy about Jesus, what good does it do to Ahaz that this prophecy will be fulfilled over 700 years later in the person of Jesus? Ahaz needs help and a promise and a sign for right now. But that's exactly what God gives him. He says, behold, the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. The picture there is God being with them right where they are at the moment. And not only, it's interesting, not only will these two kingdoms be done in 65 years, but Isaiah is giving this prophecy at 736, 734. By 609, 65 years later, by that time, 626 to 609, even Assyria, the bully on the block that everybody's worried about, they will be defeated by the Babylonians. So God is not only saying, I can take care of your problem immediately, but the one that you're going to look to help instead of me, by 609, they'll be off the world stage as a great power. So God says, here's the sign. Ahaz needs a sign now. There's going to be a son born to a virgin, and his name will be Emmanuel. Now, some argue that this word doesn't mean virgin. It just means a maiden. But the word here used, Alma, for translated a virgin, right? It's used 7 times in the Old Testament. It's used here. It's used 6 other times. And every single time the word is used, because there are other words commonly used for virgin in Hebrew, but every time this word is used, it's always the idea of an unmarried woman who is a virgin. For instance, in Genesis 24:17, Rebecca is called a maiden or virgin, and another word is used there for virgin, or the word is used, betula, meaning virgin. And it says she's a maiden or a virgin, and it specifically says when Eleazar the servant comes to meet her, because he wants to get a son for Abraham's son Isaac, it says that she's a maiden who has not known a man. And then in Exodus 2:8, again the word is used, Alma, virgin, for Miriam, Moses' sister. And this was a girl who lived with her parents, who had not known a man, who wasn't married yet, and was still a virgin. In Psalm 68:25, Alma, plural, right, are virgins who played tambourines. They were single women who took part in a procession accompanying the king to his palace. And there were rules, there were strictures in place to make sure that at the time they were virgins. Proverbs 30:19-20 talks about the way of a man with a virgin. Again, the word Alma. That way is compared to the way of an adulteress. The idea is, if a man is trying to despoil or defile a virgin without committing to her first in betrothed marriage, if he's trying to take away her virginity without first marrying her, he's committing a sin like an adulteress who's committing a sexual act against God's rules. The next time Alma is used is in Song of Songs in chapter 1, where Solomon's bride praises Solomon and says that the young women, the virgins, who are also looking for a husband, and they would have been, the idea is they're chaste, they haven't been with a man, they find him attractive as well. They think he would be a good husband to take them in to be betrothed to, and then eventually to have relations with. And finally, in that same book, Song of Solomon or Song of Songs, in chapter 6, there are 3 categories of women mentioned who lived in the queen's palace. Queens, concubines, and young women, Alma or virgins. And those young women were there to serve the queens, and because of purity laws that lasted an entire year, they were all virgins. The point is, every time that word Alma is used in the Old Testament, it's always for a woman who is chaste, who has not known a man. And so what Isaiah is saying in making this prophecy and promise for when Jesus will come, and we'll get to that, is Jesus will be born of a virgin. This word does not mean here in this context just maiden, who is a woman who might be married but also may have had relations. No, this is a word that here means virgin. All right, so the promise is given. What is Isaiah saying then? He's saying that God is going to provide an immediate answer and immediate help for you, King Ahaz. He goes on to say and give, now here's proof that God is with you and that God is going to protect you. In verse 15, it says, he, this child who's to be born, he shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. Okay, so a time is coming when this child will have moral accountability. He'll know to refuse evil and choose good. And at that time, he'll be eating curds and honey. Now, there are 2 times, and this is kind of the proof of the prophecy, there are 2 times when a boy was considered able to choose evil or choose good. The first time is kind of the early, as a youngster, in the age of accountability. You know, they would say, sometimes around 2 to 4 years of age, a child would have sufficient knowledge to be able to know right from wrong, if you will. And so taking curds and taking honey would be right around in this time, because honey would usually be given to a 2 to a 4-year-old, and they could process dairy by then. It would have mother's milk, and then they would have other dairy products and honey. So there's first an age of kind of moral knowing right from wrong. And you say, okay, well, what happened in the 2 years that this child was born? By the way, who was this child? Well, if we go to Isaiah 8, because this had to be a person that Isaiah knew and that the king would know, right? Who is this person? If we go to Isaiah 8, it says that Isaiah went to the prophetess, and she would probably have been called that because she would wind up marrying Isaiah the prophet, not because she probably didn't give out prophecies. This was just an honorific title because she was the wife of a prophetess. Now, there are other times in the Old Testament, not to chase a rabbit, but for instance, Deborah and Huldah, they were prophetesses, okay? But this one probably is not. But Isaiah, she conceives and bears a son to Isaiah, and in verse 3 of chapter 8, you shall call his name Maler Shalal Hashbaz, and we'll talk about what that means in just a second. But this would be a child that Isaiah would know, and he could show King Ahaz as proof. by the time this child can eat curds and honey and kind of know right from wrong, in about another 2 to 4 years, your problems will be over concerning these two kingdoms above you. And that's exactly what happened. Within 2 years, both of those kings were dead. They were gone. They were off the scene, and the threat from Syria and the threat from the northern kingdom of Israel was gone before Isaiah's son, who was both Maher Shalal Hashbaz, we'll come to that, and may well have had a second name, Emmanuel. And this wasn't uncommon, all right? Kings oftentimes had second names. I think King Jeconiah had one. I believe Solomon may have had a second name. Having another name was not uncommon to express more than one aspect about the person's life. I, for instance, have the name Ramon. I think I'm named after a Hollywood actor, and you think of fame and prestige and glamour and that sort of name, a worldly kind of name. But I have a middle name of Obed, which is a biblical name of one of Jesus's forefathers. And so in my life, I have both a worldly aspect and a spiritual biblical aspect, and they're both part of who I am. So it's quite possible this Emmanuel was this son, Maher Shalal Hashbaz, who was born to Isaiah. Secondly, Isaiah has given this warning, and the northern kingdom would take a little longer to, though they were being buffeted and enslaved by Assyria, it would take them longer to be off the scene. Basically, it took about another 16 years from the time of the prophecy. It took about another 12 years or so from the time of the prophecy, which means there's a second time when Jewish children kind of choose right from wrong. The second time is when you're 12 years old, getting ready to be 13, right? That's when, as a young Jewish boy, you become a man. That's when you have your bar mitzvah and you become a son of the law, or a son of the covenant, a son of the law, a son under God who, as a Jewish man, has to make moral decisions and choose for God. So basically, the second proof is that by the time this young son is reaching kind of a second stage of moral accountability where he's becoming a man, by that time the northern kingdom of Israel has been basically destroyed. And so the picture there is that this fulfillment will come as an immediate sign. Ahaz, don't worry. These guys will be destroyed. First, it'll take about 2 years. Then by the time another 10 pass, and it's 12 years from the time I say this, they'll be completely gone and not a worry. Just don't align yourself with Assyria. But he refuses to do it. And so, here's the promise in verses 16 and 17. The Lord will bring upon you and your people and upon your father's house. If you don't heed this sign, if you don't come back to me and trust in my protection, the Lord will bring upon you and your people and upon your father's house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. God says, I'm going to bring the Assyrian king who you trusted. If you don't stop this and instead ask me for protection, this is going to be days like you haven't seen since the two kingdoms split. And that bully on the block, that mobster, that big guy you're paying protection money to not harm you, first he's going to take care of those two kingdoms, and then he's coming after you. And God says, and I'm sending him. Let me ask you today, Christian, what are you doing What are you doing that you know you haven't asked God about? Your will that you haven't prayed to God to. Your way that you refuse to give up and search for God's way. Meir Shalal-Hashbaz came to mean, the name in Hebrew means quick to plunder, swift to the spoil. Isaiah's sons, he had two of them, Meir Shalal-Hashbaz, and the boy that he took when he met King Ahaz, whose name was Sher-Yeshu. Quick to plunder, swift to the spoil was the son who would soon be born, even though his name should have been called Emmanuel. He could have been that for them, God with Ahaz. But when Ahaz said no, then swift to the spoil, quick to the spoil and plunder, the king of Assyria would send his people. The southern kingdom would eventually be taken away when they could have had God with us. But the second name, Isaiah's first son, Sher-Yeshu, means a remnant will return. So even in this word of judgment, there's a word of hope. In the name Sher-Yeshu, where God says, even though, Ahaz, you haven't listened to me, and I'm going to judge you, and judge these other kingdoms, and even judge the boy on the block, yet I'm going to maintain a remnant for myself. Christian, heed the word of God today. He has given you a sign of deliverance. That sign is Emmanuel, God with us. And Matthew says that God has made his promise plain in the virgin-born Son. Don't trust in other kingdoms and other nations. Don't trust in other powers, princes, or politicians. Don't trust in your prideful way to protect you. Trust in God. Trust in Emmanuel, Jesus, the virgin born, the promised 700 years later, who is our help, who is our hope, who is our harbor, who is our all. Amen.